I've been around long enough to know exactly what that look on your face means. It means that you want to talk about the causes and effects of the massive 19th century economic restructuring of the United States that we call the market revolution. I know, it's like I'm in your head. Anyway, that market revolution ain't going to talk about itself, so if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, so in this period, metric buttloads of Americans migrated west in order to take advantage of the cheap and abundant farmland over there, not to mention the growing cities like St. Louis and Cincinnati. But in establishing their farms on the frontier, they found themselves increasingly isolated from the markets that dominated the East Coast. And that meant that they were unable to buy goods that they needed for their households, and they found it difficult to ship their excess agricultural goods to sell on distant markets. And as a 21st century high schooler, I know you relate. Anyway, in this period, a flurry of new technologies and the rapid development of industrial manufacturing started to solve those problems. It was called the market revolution, and it describes a development in which the relationship between producers and consumers became the primary economic element of American society. Now, what in the actual fresh heck does that mean? Well, think about it this way. Before the market revolution, the vast majority of Americans lived on small farms and produced whatever they needed to survive themselves. And whatever they could not make or grow for themselves, they either bought from a local store or bartered with their neighbors. But after the market revolution, more and more people bought and sold on the market what they needed to survive. Now, to be clear, at this point, the U.S. was still primarily agrarian, but manufacturing and commerce was becoming more and more prominent. And so the big effect of this revolution was twofold. First, it boosted the national economy by tying together the various regional economies, making them more and more dependent on one another. Second, it encouraged regional economic specialization. Or to say in a way you might actually understand, each region was encouraged to produce what they were best at producing and then import whatever other goods they needed from other regions. So, for example, the South was really good at growing cotton by the metric buttload. The North was really good at manufacturing mass-produced goods. And the West was really good at growing food. And so as the national economy was becoming more integrated, that meant that each region needed to lean more and more into their own specialty since everyone depended on everyone else. You smell what I'm stepping in? Good, because before I tell you about some of the new technologies that enabled the market revolution, I need to tell you about how to induce a revolution in your APUSH grade. I see what you did there. Anyway, if you want help getting an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May, then you should probably check out my APUSH Heimler review guide. It's going to help you study for your class exams and your national exams as fast as possible, and it's got loads of material to help you do that. So if that's something that you're into, then check that link in the description. Okay, now I know that you're itching to understand the causes of that great conflagration of economic interconnectedness and interdependence. Again, I know it's astonishing how well I have my fingers on the pulse of 21st century youth culture. So let me Heimsplain it up for you real quick. At the most general level, the market revolution occurred because the process of industrial manufacturing became more efficient and organized. Now, by efficient, I mean that goods could be produced a lot faster and in greater quantities than ever before. And by organized, I mean that the dizzying array of manufactured and industrial goods could be reliably transported both within the United States and to international markets. So let's get some examples of technologies that made production more efficient, and then we'll consider developments that made production more organized. First, production was made more efficient because of new technologies, and I'm only going to mention a handful. And first, let's talk about interchangeable parts. Now, this was the brainchild of our boy Eli Whitney, of whom I'll have more to say in a moment. So after having received a government contract to manufacture guns, Whitney decided to mass produce them with machines instead of making them by hand. You see, the problem with handmade guns is that if a trigger, for example, goes bad, then the whole gun is broken because that was the only trigger that would fit on that particular gun. But Whitney decided to manufacture each part of the gun separately and with machined precision, and that meant that every part of the gun was compatible with any other gun. Did your trigger break? Well, here's a new one made to the exact specifications you need. Did your shooting tube get bent? Well, here's a new one. I'm sure it's not called a shooting tube, but I don't know anything about guns. You get the point. All the individual parts were made with precision by machines, and that meant the parts were interchangeable. And not only that, but equally important, guns made with interchangeable parts were way cheaper to mass produce. And so other manufacturers grew a question mark over their head and started wondering if that works for guns, would it also work for chairs or shirts or whatever? And the answer is a resounding heck yes. And so Whitney essentially created a blueprint for a more efficient process for the mass production of goods, and it became known as the American system of manufacturing. And in its essence, this system could be boiled down to two components. First was the factory, which housed water-powered machines, though later they would be steam-powered, but I'll get to that in a moment. And the second element was a new division of labor in which small groups of unskilled workers fed raw materials to the machines to keep them running, which made goods cheaper and faster to make. And that would be the model that would fill up the horizon of American manufacturing during this period. Okay, the second technology that made production more efficient was the steam engine. As I just mentioned, the machines in all the earliest factories were water-powered, a requirement that meant that factories had to be built next to running water. But a steam engine could power machines by burning coal and heating water, and that meant that factories could be built in more strategic locations, in proximity to markets or raw materials, or both. Okay, now third, let me tell you about 3 agricultural technologies that revolutionized farming. First was the steel plow invented by John Deere. So basically, many farmers who migrated west encountered soil that was real difficult to plow with traditional wooden tools. But in 1837, John Deere created a lightweight steel plow that was able to break the Midwestern soil at a much faster pace, thus making planting way more efficient. And the second invention here was the cotton gin, invented by Eli Whitney, which I hope you remember was the interchangeable parts guy. Now, this was his first major invention, and it sped up the process of separating cotton seeds from cotton fibers, and that created the conditions for southern cotton production to go wild. And then third, we had the mechanical reaper. So if the cotton gin revolutionized southern agriculture, it was Cyrus McCormick's mechanical reaper that revolutionized western agriculture and led to greater productivity for the farmers who specialized in food production for the United States. With this machine, a single farmer could essentially do the harvesting work of 5 farmers who used hand tools. And so the point to remember here is this: these new technologies created the conditions for agricultural productivity and efficiency to skyrocket. Therefore, as machines expanded the abilities of farmers to plant and harvest faster than ever, they sought more and more land on which to plant, which in turn led to an increasing commercialization of agriculture in the West. Okay, so those are a few of the technologies that increase the efficiency of production, but you're also going to need to know exactly how the market revolution was fostered by better organization. And again, by organization, we're talking about all the processes by which goods were made and transferred to markets. Okay, now the granddaddy of all the organizing principles of the market revolution was the introduction of the factory. Now, I know I already mentioned this when I talked about Eli Whitney, but Whitney didn't establish the factory as a system in America. No, that honor goes to Samuel Slater, and he was kind of a saucy guy, so let me tell you about him. So he was a supervisor in a British factory who secretly emigrated to the United States in 1789 because he heard that investors in America were interested in building factories on the British model. And so, having memorized as much as he could about British factory schematics, Slater offered his services to a Rhode Island investor who thereafter designed a textile factory. And it worked brilliantly. The factory produced yarn at a rapid industrial pace, which was then sold to artisans who wove the yarn into finished clothing. And this system significantly increased the productivity of cloth production in the region and created a more organized manner in which to sell goods to consumers. Okay, second, I need to tell you about the invention of the telegraph. So in 1844, Samuel Morse invented this device which harnessed short electrical signals to communicate at a distance. And I don't think I can overestimate just what a big problem this solved. You see, as more and more miles of telegraph wire were hung, distant cities and markets were able to communicate with each other almost instantly, and that led to an even greater interdependence of America's increasingly complex regional business partnerships. Okay, now the last piece of the puzzle that helps us understand how the market revolution occurred is everyone's favorite, that's right, you know it and you love it, infrastructure. You see, you can mass produce goods in a real organized and efficient manner, but if you don't have a way to transport those goods to people who will buy them, then ain't no revolution happening to nobody. So here's where I tell you that in order to further foster regional economic interdependence, both the federal and state governments sponsored the construction of transportation systems. And I hope that rings a bell from a couple videos ago, because all of this is happening in the context of Henry Clay's American system. Anyway, here I only want to talk about 3 of the most important transportation developments. First, we had the construction of roads. For example, the Lancaster Turnpike in Pennsylvania was the first major engineered road constructed in the United States. Now, the Pennsylvania state government couldn't afford to pay for this fancy schmancy road, and so their legislature went ahead and passed a policy approving the road, and then a private company built it and earned revenue through tolls. And when it was done, the road connected urban Philadelphia with Pennsylvania's abundant farmland in Lancaster, which was about 60 miles away, drastically cutting the cost of transporting wheat and other crops between the two regions. And then the Cumberland Road deserves an honorable mention here as well, but since I talked about it in a previous video, I'll keep it short. This road was notable not only for its length, which connected several states, but also because it was a rare interstate road project that was conceived of and paid for by the federal government. Okay, now the second major category of new infrastructure was the development of canals. Now, a canal, in case you don't know, is a river made by humans. You see, shipping goods on water was always the best way to deliver them to distant markets, but as it turns out, sometimes the rivers don't go where you want them to go. So what do? Well, you go ahead and dig a new river. Now, during the first part of the 19th century, the US went canal crazy and started building them dang near everywhere they could. But the canal that set off that craze was the Erie Canal in New York that linked Albany to Buffalo. It was completed in 1825 and was a real success. The canal facilitated water-based trade across New York State, and that led to New York City becoming one of the US's biggest and most profitable commercial cities. And finally, we need to talk about the growth of railroads. Now, as excited as everyone was about the canal boom, by the 1830s, railroads were offering stiff competition as the most efficient means of regional economic interconnection. You see, thanks to steam-powered locomotives, goods and passengers could be transported quickly and cheaply across the United States, and that both caused the market revolution and further fostered it as well. But I do need to mention one thing you'll need to remember. Many of these infrastructure projects I mentioned did a great job of connecting the North and West while leaving the southern states fewer opportunities to take advantage of the increasing interconnection. Okay, the last thing I need to tell you about is a couple of Supreme Court cases that facilitated the conditions for the market revolution as well. First, let's consider McCulloch v. Maryland, which was decided in 1819. Now, I talked about this in a previous video in the context of Chief Justice John Marshall's attempts to strengthen the federal government at the expense of state government. Basically, the state of Maryland tried to levy a tax on the local branch of the national bank, and the court put the kibosh on that practice. But in the context of the market revolution, this decision enhanced the federal government's ability to create favorable conditions for explosive market growth, things like stable currency and the regulation of interstate commerce. Second, let's consider Gibbons v. Ogden, which was decided in 1824. Essentially, the court struck down a New York state law that granted a private company a monopoly on trade between New York and New Jersey. In the decision, Marshall pointed out that the Constitution granted the power to regulate interstate commerce to the federal government and not to state governments. And so, with decisions like these and a handful of others, the court created fertile conditions for the spectacular national economic growth that came in the market revolution. Okay, you can click here to watch my other videos for Unit 4, or you can click here to grab my APUSH Heimler review guide, which is going to help you get an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. And I'm glad you came around, and I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.